March 17, 1943. Wilhelmshaven Naval Base, North Sea coast. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock pressed his palms against the cold iron railing of U-96's conning tower, watching the fog roll across the harbor like a shroud. The acrid smell of diesel fuel mixed with sea salt burned in his nostrils. His hands, weathered by 5 Atlantic patrols, trembled, not from cold, but from the numbers in the briefing room an hour earlier. Numbers that made no sense. Numbers that violated every principle of naval warfare he'd learned at the academy. "They're building faster than we can sink them," his executive officer had whispered, voice hollow. The intelligence report lay between them on the metal table. American shipyards had launched 42 merchant vessels in February alone. 42 in a single month. U-96's best patrol had destroyed 3. The arithmetic was impossible. It had to be propaganda, but Lehmann Willenbrock had seen the photographs. Liberty ships, still wet with fresh paint, stretching in rows at American ports like manufactured toys. He thought of the freighter they'd torpedoed 3 weeks ago, 12 hours stalking, positioning, calculating angles. One ship. 12 hours of his life, hundreds of man-hours from his crew. A torpedo worth 50,000 Reichsmarks, sunk in 4 minutes. According to the Americans, they'd replaced it in 4 days. The fog thickened. Somewhere across that gray Atlantic, in shipyards he'd never see, welders were already working on his obsolescence. The thought sat in his chest like ballast water, heavy and cold. Yachitriturn. The prophecy that no one believed. On December 29, 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had sat before a microphone in the White House and spoken words that Japanese and German military planners would file away as rhetorical bluster. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," the American president declared, his voice carrying through radio static to millions of homes. "For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself." In Tokyo, where it was already December 30th, Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omai of the Imperial Japanese Navy's planning section read the translated transcript over breakfast. He set down his rice bowl and considered the statement with the careful attention of a professional strategist. America's production capacity was certainly significant. This was acknowledged. But the United States was a nation of soft civilians, shopkeepers, and moviegoers who blanched at casualty lists. Their industrial numbers looked impressive on paper, but war required more than factories. It required will, sacrifice, the spiritual fortitude to endure suffering. The Americans had none of these things. Omai had studied at Harvard in the 1930s. He remembered the students, their casual wealth, their obsession with comfort and entertainment. He remembered drugstores with chrome soda fountains and parking lots full of automobiles. A rich nation, certainly. But wealth bred weakness. The Americans would produce many things, but could they produce warriors? Could their assembly lines manufacture the spirit that drove a kamikaze pilot or a German U-boat ace? The question answered itself. In Berlin, similar calculations were taking place in the Kriegsmarine's planning offices. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz had run the numbers on U-boat warfare with mathematical precision. The formula was elegant. If German submarines could sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, Britain would be starved into submission within 18 months. Replacement capacity was finite. Shipbuilding took time, 12 to 18 months for a standard cargo vessel. The convoy system could only do so much when faced with wolf packs of 30 or 40 U-boats operating in coordinated attacks. The Americans talked of building ships. Everyone built ships. The question was, how many and how fast? The German naval staff had estimates. American shipyards might launch 200 cargo vessels in 1942, perhaps 300 if they pushed hard and accepted lower quality. This would replace losses but not significantly exceed them. The Battle of the Atlantic would remain a grinding war of attrition, exactly the kind of war Germany was equipped to win through technical superiority and tactical brilliance. What neither Dönitz nor Omai nor any Axis planner truly comprehended was that America was not preparing to fight their kind of war. America was preparing to fight a different war entirely, one that had never existed before in human history. WWII. The Revelation at Richmond, May 1943. Richmond, California. Yoshiko Nakamura stood at Gate 3 of the Richmond Kaiser shipyard with a lunch pail in one hand and a time card in the other. 6 months ago, she'd been teaching second grade in Alameda. Then came Executive Order 9066, the buses to Tanforan Assembly Center, the tar paper barracks, the humiliation of loyalty questionnaires. Her brother was in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, fighting in Italy to prove what should never have needed proving. She'd been released for essential war work. Essential. The word tasted like ashes mixed with pride. The shipyard spread before her like a vision from a dream of industry. Cranes stretched into the morning sky, their cables singing in the wind. The air vibrated with a soundscape that was almost musical, the rhythmic thunder of riveting guns, the hiss of welding torches, the deep bass groan of steel plates being positioned by electromagnets. 17,000 workers moved through this mechanical choreography in 3 8-hour shifts that never stopped. Sunday, Monday, Christmas Day, the work never ceased. First day? A woman in coveralls and a welding hood appeared beside her. Red hair tucked under a bandana, arms that looked like they could wrestle steel beams into submission. "I'm Betty. You'll be in my crew on Hull 440. Hull 440, not a name, just a number. Because names took time, and time was the one thing they didn't waste here. Betty led her through the chaos that resolved as they walked into something more than chaos, into pattern, system, a vast choreography of assembly that seemed impossible until you saw it functioning. They passed Hull 438, already 70% complete, though its keel had been laid only 9 days ago. Hull 439 was having its boilers installed, each weighing 12 tons, swung into place by cranes with such precision that grown men looked like children playing with building blocks. "We launched 441 yesterday," Betty said, her voice matter of fact. Took her from keel to launch in 14 days. New record. Engineering team thinks they can get it down to 12. 14 days. Yoshiko had spent 14 years earning her teaching credentials. Hull 440 was still mostly skeleton, the keel laid, ribs of steel rising like the frame of an impossibly large building. Workers moved over it like ants on a carcass, except ants had never moved with such purpose, such coordinated precision. Prefabricated sections arrived on flatbed trucks every 20 minutes, entire deck sections already welded, wired, fitted with ventilation. Cranes lifted them into place. Welding crews descended, their torches creating constellations of sparks. 30 minutes later, another section arrived. "How?" Yoshiko whispered. Betty grinned. "We stopped building ships the way ships have always been built. Now we build them the way Ford builds cars." The comparison seemed absurd. Ships weren't cars. But as Yoshiko watched, she began to understand. Traditional shipbuilding was a craft, each vessel unique, built from keel up in a careful sequence that couldn't be rushed. But Henry J. Kaiser, the industrialist who'd never built a ship before the war, had looked at shipbuilding and seen only inefficiency. Why build one ship at a time? Why not build sections simultaneously, then assemble? It was heretical. It was brilliant. It was working. The mathematics of industrial warfare. The numbers told a story that military strategists were still trying to comprehend. In 1941, American shipyards launched 1.1 million tons of merchant shipping. Respectable, but not overwhelming. German U-boats sank 2.3 million tons that year, more than twice the replacement rate. The arithmetic favored the Reich. In 1942, as Kaiser's revolutionary method spread and new shipyards opened from Maine to California, American production reached 5.3 million tons. The Germans sank 6.2 million tons, still maintaining superiority. But the gap was closing, and closing in a way that suggested something ominous. Then came 1943. American shipyards launched 13.5 million tons of merchant shipping, 13.5 million. That was 36,000 tons every single day. While German U-boats achieved their best year ever, sinking 3.2 million tons, the arithmetic had inverted. For every ton the Germans sank, America built 4. But tonnage was abstractions. What mattered were the ships themselves, the Liberty ships that rolled off the ways with such speed that it seemed almost insulting to traditional maritime craft. The SS Robert E., Peary held the record, launched in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes from the moment her keel was laid. 4 days. Ancient Roman galleys took months. Nelson's HMS Victory required 6 years. The Bismarck, pride of the Kriegsmarine, had taken 5 years from keel laying to commissioning. The Americans were building ocean-going cargo vessels in less time than it took to plan a weekend party. The Germans called them ugly ducklings, and they were ugly. Boxy, ungainly, with utilitarian lines that would make any naval architect wince. Maximum cargo capacity, minimum construction time. No grace, no beauty. Just brutal functionality replicated on a scale that defied comprehension. By war's end, American shipyards would launch 2,751 Liberty ships, not including the hundreds of tankers, Victory ships, escort carriers, destroyers, and landing craft. 1 Liberty ship every day, some days 2 or 3. The RERS. The Disbelief in Tokyo, October 1943, Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff Headquarters, Tokyo. Commander Omai sat in the briefing room, listening to intelligence reports from the Pacific that couldn't possibly be accurate. The numbers had to be wrong. Reality didn't work this way. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 4 carriers that represented years of construction, decades of naval doctrine, the cream of Japan's maritime striking power. Replacing them would take years. The combined fleet had been crippled in a single afternoon. 16 months later, the Americans had not only replaced their losses from Midway, they had multiplied them. The intelligence reports showed 17 new Essex-class fleet carriers under construction or already commissioned. 17, plus dozens of escort carriers being mass-produced using merchant ship hulls. The Americans were building carriers faster than Japan could train pilots. "There must be an error in translation," said Captain Yasumi. "These production figures are confirmed by multiple sources," the intelligence officer interrupted. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "Including aerial reconnaissance photographs and signals intercepts. The Americans commissioned 6 new Essex-class carriers this year." 6. They're launching 1 every 60 days. The silence in the room carried a weight that had nothing to do with humidity or Tokyo's autumn heat. Every officer present understood ship construction timelines. The Taiho, Japan's newest carrier, had taken 3 years to build. The Americans were doing it in 1/3 that time, and doing it simultaneously in multiple shipyards, and doing it with vessels that were, according to every available report, superior in design to their predecessors. Omai felt something shift in his understanding, like a gear slipping in a complex machine. This wasn't just about production capacity. This was about a fundamentally different conception of industrial warfare. Japan built ships the way samurai forged swords, each vessel a work of craftsmanship, unique, painstakingly created by masters of their trade. Quality took time. Excellence demanded patience. The Yamato, with her 18-inch guns and massive armor, had required 4 years of construction. She was magnificent, a floating city of steel representing the absolute pinnacle of naval engineering. America built ships the way they built automobiles. Standardized, modular, assembled from interchangeable parts by workers who might never see the finished product. A Ford Model T rolling off the line in Detroit wasn't a masterpiece of automotive design. It was just a car, one of millions, identical and unremarkable. But when you needed 1,000,000 cars, you didn't commission master craftsmen. You built assembly lines. The Americans had turned the Pacific Ocean into an assembly line. The breaking point. March 1944, U-181, Atlantic Ocean, 400 miles west of the Canary Islands. Captain Lieutenant Wolfgang Luth studied the convoy through his periscope with the patience that had made him Germany's second most successful U-boat commander. 18 merchant ships in 9 columns, escorted by 4 destroyers and 2 corvettes. Standard Atlantic convoy formation. 6 months ago, this would have been a target-rich environment. Attack at night, pick off stragglers, dive before the escorts could respond. 3, maybe 4 ships sunk before dawn. Now he watched and calculated and felt the weight of futility settling into his bones. The convoy was making 10 knots, slow enough that U-181 could match speed while submerged, but the escorts had improved their tactics. Radar was everywhere now, making surface approaches suicidal. The destroyers traveled with practiced efficiency, sweeping constantly with their sonar. Most ominous were the aircraft, land-based liberators with their damned search radar and depth charges. The mid-Atlantic air gap, where U-boats had once hunted with impunity, was closing. But even if he could sink half the convoy, say 9 ships, the Americans would have replaced them by the time these escorts returned to New York. The arithmetic had become obscene. Luth lowered the periscope and retreated to his tiny cabin, pulling out his war diary. The entries told a story of diminishing returns: 23 ships sunk on his first patrol in 1939, 14 on his second, 8 on his third. This patrol, his 10th, had yielded 2 confirmed kills in 3 months, 2 ships that the Americans had replaced within a week. He thought about the young men in his crew, boys really, most under 25. They still believed in victory because they'd been told to believe, because doubt was treason, because the alternative was unbearable. They read propaganda newspapers reporting defensive victories and strategic withdrawals and convinced themselves that Germany was winning, but Luth had access to the raw intelligence reports. He knew the truth. Germany had started the war with 57 U-boats. Through 1940, 1941, and 1942, the U-boat fleet had grown to over 400 boats through heroic construction efforts. 400 U-boats, the largest submarine fleet in history, capable of interdicting convoy routes across the entire Atlantic. And yet merchant ship sinkings were declining while Allied shipping tonnage increased. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't being lost through tactical defeats. German U-boat crews remained among the finest in the world. It was being lost in American shipyards, where the outcome had been determined before the first torpedo was fired. Gross Admiral Dunnet still spoke of victory. In his speeches, the U-boat arm remained Germany's greatest weapon, the force that would strangle Britain and prevent American supplies from reaching Europe. The tonnage war could still be won, he insisted, if each U-boat maintained pressure, if crews remained courageous, if the spirit of sacrifice prevailed. But spirit couldn't sink ships faster than Kaiser could build them. Courage couldn't change mathematics. Luth wrote in his diary, "We are fighting industrial output with individual valor. It is like stopping a flood with sandbags placed one at a time." Chardissa, the woman who riveted while the world burned. August 1944. Boeing Aircraft Company, Seattle, Washington. Rose Wilson Monroe stood on a platform 12 feet above the factory floor, her rivet gun singing its pneumatic song as she attached wing sections to a B-17 fuselage. The factory stretched for nearly half a mile in every direction, a cathedral of aluminum and steel where bomber aircraft took shape with assembly line efficiency that would have seemed like science fiction 4 years ago. Rose had been a waitress in Kentucky before the war. Her husband Walter was somewhere in France with the 1st Infantry Division. Her 2 daughters lived with her mother while Rose worked 10-hour shifts 6 days a week, earning 95 cents an hour doing work that had been considered too technically demanding for women until the war made such prejudices a luxury America couldn't afford. "How many today?" she called to Eleanor, her riveting partner. "7 so far? Floor supervisor says we might hit 8 if the swing shift meets quota." 8 B-17 Flying Fortresses, each one a 4-engine heavy bomber capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of ordnance to targets in occupied Europe. 8 aircraft in a single day from one factory. Boeing's Seattle plant was just one of dozens producing bombers, fighters, transports, and reconnaissance aircraft in quantities that seemed drawn from fantasy. The mathematics of aircraft production followed the same impossible trajectory as shipbuilding. In 1939, American factories had built 2,141 military aircraft, respectable by peacetime standards. In 1940, production increased to 6,086 aircraft. Roosevelt demanded 50,000 planes per year, and military planners thought he was delusional. In 1944, American factories produced 96,218 military aircraft. 96,000. That was 264 aircraft every day. 1 aircraft every 5.5 minutes, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Germany, fighting for its existence, managed 39,807 aircraft in 1944 despite heroic efforts and slave labor. Japan produced 28,180. Combined, the Axis powers were being outproduced 2-to-1 by a nation that was also building ships, tanks, trucks, artillery, and every other implement of modern warfare in equally staggering quantities. Rose didn't think about these numbers while she worked. She thought about the rivet she was placing, this specific rivet in this specific hole, creating this specific seal that would keep this specific aircraft from failing at 25,000 feet over Germany. She thought about Walter and whether the bombers she built might somehow shorten the war and bring him home. She thought about her daughters and whether they would remember her face when she finally returned to Kentucky. But sometimes during lunch break, sitting with the other women in the cafeteria, Rose would look around at the thousands of workers and think, we're not just building weapons, we're building the future. This factory, these women, this impossible production, we're proving something that the world will never forget. She was right, but she couldn't know, not yet, just how completely the arsenal of democracy would rewrite the rules of global power. WWII, The Realization in Berlin, January 1945. Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production, Berlin. Albert Speer sat in his office surrounded by production reports that read like casualty lists. Outside, the city smoldered from the latest Allied bombing raid. Inside, the numbers on the pages before him told a story even more devastating than the bombs. German tank production in 1944, 18,156 vehicles. American tank production in 1944, 17,565 vehicles. For a moment, the figures seemed almost encouraging. Germany had actually outproduced America in tanks. Surely this meant. But then Speer looked at the next line. Soviet tank production in 1944, 29,000 vehicles. Combined Allied tank production, 46,565 versus Germany's 18,956. And that didn't account for British production or Canadian or the fact that American factories were also producing trucks, half-tracks, armored cars, and thousands of other vehicles while German industry struggled to maintain even basic production levels. The Americans had built 812,000 trucks in 1944. 812,000. Germany had built 88,000. The Wehrmacht was being outproduced in transport vehicles at a ratio of 9-to-1. Tanks could win battles, but trucks won wars, moving supplies, transporting troops, maintaining the logistics network that kept armies functional. The Americans understood this with a clarity that German military planners, raised on theories of lightning warfare and armored spearheads, had never grasped. But it was the aircraft numbers that destroyed any remaining illusions. America, 96,318 military aircraft in 1944. Germany, 39,807 military aircraft in 1944. Britain, 26,461 military aircraft in 1944. Soviet Union, 40,300 military aircraft in 1944. Combined Allied production, 163,079 aircraft versus Germany's 39,807. A ratio of more than 4-to-1. Germany's pilots were better trained, its aircraft designs often superior. The Me-262 jet fighter was 2 years ahead of anything the Allies fielded. But training and technology couldn't overcome those numbers. Even if every German pilot shot down 4 Allied aircraft, the Allies would still have aircraft left over. Speer had been Hitler's architect, the man who designed the Nuremberg rally grounds and the grand buildings that were supposed to last 1,000 years. He'd become Minister of Armaments in 1942 and had worked miracles, tripling German production despite Allied bombing, despite raw material shortages, despite transportation networks collapsing under aerial assault. But miracles had limits. Germany produced what it could with the resources it had. America produced what it wanted with resources it had barely begun to tap. The fundamental miscalculation Speer realized had occurred years before the first shot was fired. German and Japanese military planners had looked at American production capacity and seen only potential, factories that could build many things if properly motivated, if willing to sacrifice, if pushed to their limits. They had failed to understand that American industrial capacity didn't need to be pushed to limits. It was operating comfortably below maximum capacity, even while producing at levels the Axis couldn't match. The United States was fighting history's most expensive war without rationing gasoline for civilian use until 1942, without significantly disrupting consumer goods production, without asking its population to endure anything approaching German or Japanese sacrifice levels. Americans ate better during the war than they had during the Depression. They bought more consumer goods. They went to movies, took vacations, lived lives that would seem obscene to a German family subsisting on ration cards and ersatz coffee. And still the production numbers climbed. Speer had read pre-war assessments that dismissed American industrial might because Americans were soft, lacking the warrior spirit necessary for total war. The assessments were correct about American comfort levels, but catastrophically wrong about the implications. Americans didn't need to be comfortable with sacrifice because their industrial capacity was so vast that they didn't require sacrifice. They could have both guns and butter, bombers and automobiles, total war and economic prosperity. It was this abundance, more than any military doctrine or strategic brilliance, that made Allied victory inevitable. That's the tank that won by existing private first class. Robert Hayes stood in front of his 5th Sherman tank in 14 months and wondered if the Germans understood what they were fighting. His first Sherman had been destroyed by a Panther tank outside Caen, direct hit through the frontal armor, killing the driver and bowgunner instantly. Hayes had escaped through the turret hatch with burns on his hands and ringing in his ears that lasted for weeks. His second Sherman took an 80mm shell from a Tiger during the Battle of the Bulge. The round penetrated the turret, killing the commander and loader. Hayes bailed out, spent 2 days walking back to Allied lines through snow and enemy territory. The third Sherman threw a track on a mine. The fourth suffered a mechanical breakdown that required engine replacement. Now he stood beside Sherman number 5, freshly delivered from the replacement depot, smelling of new paint and Cosmoline grease. It looked identical to the previous 4. Same 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. Same thin armor that German anti-tank guns could punch through at absurd distances. Same tendency to catch fire when hit, earning the nickname Ronson after the cigarette lighter that lights first time every time. The Sherman was, by German standards, an inferior tank. The Panther was faster, better armored, more powerfully armed. The Tiger was even more formidable, a 56-ton monster whose 88 Plyma gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even fight back. German tankers spoke of their vehicles with professional pride, knowing they piloted superior machines. But superiority was a peacetime luxury. War demanded quantity. Germany produced 6,000 Panthers and 1,247 Tigers during the entire war, magnificent machines that took skilled labor and scarce resources to build. America produced 49,234 Sherman tanks, 49,000. They rolled off assembly lines in Detroit, Cleveland, and Grand Rapids with the same efficiency that had once produced automobiles. A Tiger could destroy 5 Shermans before being knocked out. This was established fact, proven in numerous engagements. But when the Americans sent 8 Shermans and could replace all 8 within a week, the Tiger's superiority became academic. Hayes understood this with a clarity that came from watching friends die, and then watching those friends be replaced, their tanks be replaced, everything be replaced with a speed that seemed to mock the very concept of loss. The Germans built each tank as if it were irreplaceable because for them it nearly was. Americans built tanks as if they were disposable because for them they nearly were. "She's yours, Hayes," said the quartermaster sergeant, handing over the vehicle log. "Try to keep this one for more than a month, yeah?" Hayes climbed into the driver's seat, feeling the familiar contours of controls he'd operated in 4 previous vehicles. Same layout, same engine sound, same everything. That was the secret the Germans didn't understand. Interchangeable parts meant interchangeable crews. A trained Sherman driver could operate any Sherman. A trained gunner knew exactly where every control would be. Standardization meant a crew could be assembled from survivors of different units and be combat effective within hours. The Germans, with their multiple tank models and constant design improvements, created vehicles that required specialized training and maintenance. Every improvement made logistics more complex. Every variation meant more spare parts, more training time, more potential points of failure. The Sherman was deliberately kept simple, mechanically reliable, easy to maintain. Built with the understanding that a good tank that exists is better than a perfect tank that doesn't. That afternoon, Hayes's new Sherman joined a column of 47 identical tanks advancing toward the Rhine. Somewhere ahead, perhaps 5 or 6 Tigers waited in concealed positions, their crews confident in their vehicle's superiority. They would destroy perhaps a dozen Shermans before being overwhelmed by numbers, flanked, or running out of ammunition. The Tigers would fight brilliantly and die heroically. The Shermans would simply win. The moment of understanding, April 1945, approaching Okinawa aboard USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, CB-42. Seaman Koichi Yamada stood on the deck of the carrier, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles whitened. He'd surrendered 3 days ago after his submarine, I-58, had been forced to surface by depth charges. Now he was a prisoner of war, being transported to internment camps in Hawaii. The Franklin D. Roosevelt was one of the new Midway-class supercarriers, 45,000 tons, capable of carrying 130 aircraft, commissioned just months after being laid down in a New York shipyard. She was magnificent, a floating city that represented engineering on a scale that seemed to defy physics. But it wasn't the carrier that broke Yamada's understanding of the war. It was the view from the carrier. He counted 17 American carriers visible from where he stood, 17. Plus dozens of destroyers, cruisers, battleships, destroyer escorts, landing craft, supply vessels, a fleet so vast it looked like a city built on water, stretching to the horizon in every direction. The sheer quantity was obscene, overwhelming, impossible. Japan had started the war with 10 carriers. Yamada had studied their names, their specifications, their battle histories, with the reverence other men reserved for religious texts. Each carrier was precious, irreplaceable, the product of years of construction and decades of naval tradition. America, according to intelligence reports, had commissioned 141 carriers during the war. Most were escort carriers, smaller, slower, converted from merchant hulls using the same mass production techniques as Liberty ships. But there were also 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, each one equal or superior to Japan's finest vessels. The mathematics was so absurd it became almost abstract. For every carrier Japan built, America built 14. For every ship Japan could repair, America built 50 new ones. The Japanese combined fleet had fought brilliantly at Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea, at Midway, at Guadalcanal. Japanese pilots and sailors had demonstrated courage and skill that would be remembered for generations. And it didn't matter. None of it mattered. The war had been decided not by battles but by shipyards, not by warriors but by welders, not by tactics but by assembly lines. An American officer walked past, noticed Yamada staring at the fleet. Impressive, isn't it? The officer's Japanese was basic but understandable. That's just Task Force 58. We've got 3 more task forces this size in the Pacific. Yamada said nothing. What was there to say? That Japan's entire pre-war navy would have been outnumbered by a single American task force. That the Imperial Japanese Navy had fought the last 3 years with decreasing fuel supplies while American vessels operated without apparent resource constraints. That Japanese pilots trained for months before combat, while Americans seemed to produce trained air crews with the same efficiency they produced aircraft. The officer lit a cigarette, offered one to Yamada. Yamada took it. His first American cigarette. The taste was different, smoother, obviously of higher quality than the harsh tobacco available in Japan even before rationing began. "We didn't know," Yamada said finally, his English barely adequate. "We didn't understand." The officer nodded slowly, his expression neither triumphant nor sympathetic. "We barely understood it ourselves. We just built things. Kept building. Never stopped." That was the truth that Japanese naval planners had missed. America hadn't outfought Japan. America had outbuilt Japan so completely that military skill became irrelevant. You couldn't sink ships faster than American yards could launch them. You couldn't shoot down aircraft faster than American factories could produce them. You couldn't win a war of attrition against a nation whose production capacity seemed limited only by imagination. Yamada thought about the young pilots who'd flown kamikaze missions in the war's final years, diving their aircraft into American ships in suicide attacks. They'd been told these sacrifices were necessary, that trading one life for one ship would eventually exhaust American naval strength. The pilots had believed this because they had to believe it, because the alternative, that their deaths accomplished nothing against an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted, was too horrifying to accept. But it was true. Every kamikaze pilot who succeeded in sinking an American ship had statistically delayed American victory by approximately 14 hours, the time it took to build a replacement vessel. The Americans, in their infinite industrial abundance, could afford to exchange steel for lives at ratios that made traditional military calculations meaningless. The cigarette burned down to nothing between Yamada's fingers. The fleet stretched to the horizon. The war was over, had been over, since the moment the first Liberty ship splashed into the water at a speed that violated every historical precedent for shipbuilding. Japan had fought valiantly and lost inevitably. Germany had fought brilliantly and lost mathematically. The arsenal of democracy had produced weapons in quantities that transformed war from art into arithmetic. The Long Peace. November 1945, Richmond Kaiser Shipyard, California. Yoshiko Nakamura stood at the same gate where she'd entered 2.5 years ago, watching the last Liberty ship slide down the ways. Hull number 2551, no special ceremony, no fanfare. Just another ship joining the 2,750 others, identical and unremarkable, except for the fact that collectively they'd broken an empire that had thought itself invincible. The war was over. Japan had surrendered in August after atomic bombs, themselves products of the arsenal's industrial complex, had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Germany had surrendered in May, crushed beneath millions of tons of steel that had rolled off American assembly lines with mechanical indifference to Wehrmacht resistance. The shipyard was closing. No more Liberty ships needed, no more emergency production, no more around-the-clock shifts. 17,000 workers would be returning to peacetime lives, whatever that meant after 4 years of industrial warfare. Yoshiko held her final paycheck. 2 weeks' wages plus a small bonus for exemplary service in defense of the nation. It seemed inadequate compensation for the transformation she'd undergone. She'd arrived at this gate as a displaced person, a prisoner released for essential work, suspect in her own country. She'd left as a skilled welder who'd helped build 37 Liberty ships, whose work had contributed to victory in ways that couldn't be measured in paychecks. Betty found her at the gate, still wearing coveralls, though there was no work left to do. "Strange, isn't it?" Betty said. "All that production, all that noise, and now—" Silence. They stood together, 2 women among thousands, looking at empty slipways that had birthed a fleet larger than most nations' entire naval forces. The machinery sat quiet. The cranes were still. The assembly lines had stopped. But what they'd built remained. Not just ships, but a demonstration of industrial capacity that had rewritten global power dynamics forever. The Soviet Union had noticed. Stalin's post-war industrial policy would be shaped by American production methods. Britain had noticed the welfare state would be built on economic principles that prioritized output over tradition. Every nation emerging from the war's rubble understood the lesson. Military power in the modern age rested on industrial capacity, not warrior spirit or tactical brilliance. The Germans had fielded superior tanks, better trained soldiers, more experienced commanders. None of it mattered when the Americans arrived with adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities, backed by logistics networks that never failed and supply lines that never ran dry. The Japanese had demonstrated courage beyond measure, fighting with a dedication that bordered on religious fervor. None of it mattered when the Americans deployed resources so vast that trading lives for material became mathematically futile. The arsenal of democracy hadn't just won a war. It had obsoleted a certain type of war, the kind where individual heroism and tactical genius could overcome material disadvantage. From 1945 forward, industrial capacity would be the ultimate arbiter of military power. No nation would ever again enter a major conflict without calculating production ratios, replacement rates, manufacturing capacity. Yoshiko thought about her brother, returned from Italy with medals and a limp. He'd fought in the mountains near Monte Cassino, where men died for yards of ground. She'd fought here, in this shipyard, where victory was measured in tonnage per day. His war had been heroic. Hers had been industrial. History would remember his. But hers had been decisive. "What will you do now?" Betty asked. Yoshiko didn't know, returned to teaching perhaps. Or maybe not. Maybe there was no returning to what had been before. The war had changed everything, not just nations and borders, but the fundamental understanding of what was possible when human labor combined with industrial organization at scales previously unimagined. "I'll find something," Yoshiko said. "We all will." The sun was setting over the San Francisco Bay, painting the silent shipyard in gold and shadow. In the distance, a Liberty ship, maybe one she'd helped build, was steaming toward the Pacific, carrying supplies to occupied Japan. The irony wasn't lost on her. American ships, built by American workers, including Japanese Americans, now bringing food and medicine to rebuild the nation that had started the war. That was the other lesson of the arsenal. Abundance could afford mercy. Nations fighting for survival became brutal by necessity. Nations with surplus could afford to be generous. America rebuilt its enemies not from altruism alone, but because its industrial capacity made reconstruction economically feasible. The Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Japan, these were possible only because American factories could produce for peace as efficiently as they'd produced for war. Betty started walking toward the parking lot. Yoshiko followed. Behind them, Hull 2751 sat in the water, ready for fitting out. The last Liberty ship. The end of an era that had lasted less than 4 years, but had changed human history forever. Zertürz, the Shadow of Memory. March 1947. U-boat Memorial, Moltenort, Germany. Heinrich Lehmann of Willenbrock stood before the memorial to fallen submariners, his U-boat commander's cap held in weathered hands. The war had ended nearly 2 years ago. He'd survived, which meant he'd failed less catastrophically than most. U-96 had been destroyed in an Allied air raid in 1945, bombed at dock in Wilhelmshaven before she could make one final patrol. Of the 40,000 men who'd served in the U-boat arm, 30,000 had died, 75% casualties, the highest loss rate of any military branch in any nation during the entire war. They'd fought with desperate courage against impossible odds, and the Atlantic Ocean had become their cemetery. Lehmann Willenbrock thought about the briefing in March 1943, when he'd first understood the truth. The intelligence officer's hollow voice, "They're building faster than we can sink them." 4 years later, the arithmetic had played out exactly as that sentence predicted. German U-boats had sunk 2,779 Allied merchant ships during the war, an impressive number representing countless hours of danger, thousands of torpedoes, extraordinary tactical skill. American shipyards had built more than 5,000 merchant vessels during the same period. The Germans had killed more than 30,000 Allied merchant sailors, a horrific toll that should have crippled enemy shipping. But the Allies simply trained more sailors, built more ships, maintained convoy schedules with mechanical regularity. 1 ship sunk, 2 ships built, 1 crew lost, 3 crews trained. The machinery of industrial warfare absorbed losses that would have broken any previous military force in history. A young man approached the memorial, maybe 20 years old. Too young to have fought, old enough to remember the propaganda that had promised victory. "Were you there?" the young man asked. "In the U-boats?" Lehmann Willenbrock nodded. "They say we almost won. They say if we'd had more U-boats, better torpedoes, different tactics—" "We never could have won," Lehmann Willenbrock interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "Not the way we fought. Not against that enemy." The young man looked confused. But the crews were brave. The technology was advanced. The tactics, all true, all irrelevant. Lehmann Willenbrock gestured toward the memorial, where names stretched in endless columns. These men died believing their sacrifices would change the war's outcome. They couldn't know, none of us could know, that the war's outcome had been determined in factories thousands of miles away by workers who never fired a shot. He thought about the Americans he'd met in POW camps after surrender. Regular people mostly, farmers, shopkeepers, factory workers conscripted into military service. They'd spoken of hardship, rationing, long work hours, family members overseas. But their hardship included regular meals, heated barracks, medical care, mail service that functioned with peacetime reliability. They'd fought history's largest war while maintaining living standards that most Germans would have considered luxurious, even before the war began. That was the fundamental asymmetry. Germany had mobilized totally, straining every resource, demanding maximum sacrifice from every citizen. America had mobilized partially, treating the war as a terrible necessity that required focus but not total societal transformation. And even mobilizing partially, America had outproduced the entire Axis combined. "What should we remember?" the young man asked. Lehman Willenbrock considered the question. What lesson could be extracted from this catastrophe? That courage was meaningless? That sacrifice accomplished nothing? That military skill couldn't overcome industrial disparity? No. The lesson was subtler and more disturbing. "Remember that wars are won by factories before the first battle begins," Lehman Willenbrock said. "Remember that in modern warfare, production capacity determines victory more surely than valor or genius. Remember that we fought a 19th century war against a 21st century enemy." He replaced his cap and walked away from the memorial. Behind him, the names of 30,000 submariners testified to courage that had been ultimately insufficient. The Battle of the Atlantic had been lost not in the ocean but in American shipyards, where welders like Yoshiko Nakamura had proven more decisive than U-boat aces. Yavr, The Inheritance, July 1969, Cape Kennedy, Florida. Robert Hayes stood in the crowd watching Apollo 11 prepare for launch, thinking about tanks and the strange paths history takes. He was 52 years old, gray-haired, working as a civil engineer in Houston. His war had ended 24 years ago, but he'd never stopped thinking about the lessons learned in Sherman tanks rolling through France and Germany. The Saturn V rocket on the launch pad was, in many ways, a descendant of the arsenal of democracy. Not directly, rocket technology came from German scientists and Cold War competition. But the philosophy underlying the Apollo program was pure American industrial pragmatism. Identify the goal, marshal resources, solve problems through systematic engineering rather than brilliant breakthroughs. The Saturn V wasn't elegant. It was a brute force solution, 3 million parts assembled with the same mass production techniques that had built Liberty ships and Sherman tanks. Where German rocket scientists had dreamed of perfect designs, American engineers had built workable systems. Where Soviet planners had prioritized spectacular achievements, American project managers had focused on reliable repetition. Apollo 11 would be followed by Apollo 12, then 13, 14, 15, continuing until the program ended. Standardized systems, interchangeable parts. The same philosophy that had let Hayes climb into 5 different Sherman tanks, knowing exactly where every control would be. The countdown reached 0. The engines ignited with a roar that shook the ground for miles. The rocket lifted slowly, impossibly, fighting gravity with controlled fury. Hayes watched it climb toward the sky, leaving a trail of fire and thunder. He thought about his first Sherman, destroyed outside Caen. His second knocked out in the bulge, the third, fourth, fifth, each one replaced with speed that had seemed almost insulting to the crews who died in them. At the time, it had felt like the machines mattered more than the men. Only later had he understood. The machines mattered because they could be replaced. The men couldn't be. The disposable Sherman had been, paradoxically, designed to save lives through expendability. Build enough tanks, and you could afford to lose them without losing the war. Build them fast enough, and crews had replacements immediately. Build them simple enough, and any crew could operate any tank. The Sherman's greatest weakness, its vulnerability, had been accepted as the price of quantity. Better to have 5 mediocre tanks than 1 excellent tank and 4 empty positions. The Apollo program had adopted similar logic. NASA engineers called it redundancy. Backup systems for every critical function, multiple paths to success, the assumption that components would fail, and planning accordingly. It was unsexy engineering, the opposite of the elegant simplicity that designers preferred. But it worked. The rocket disappeared into the clouds. In 8 days, if everything went according to plan, 2 men would walk on the moon. They'd get there riding a massive tower of standardized components, manufactured by thousands of contractors using techniques perfected during World War II. The arsenal of democracy had evolved into the arsenal of exploration, applying industrial principles to new frontiers. Hayes thought about the Germans and Japanese he'd fought against. Brave men, skilled men, men who'd believed in their cause with sincere dedication. They'd lost not because they were wrong to believe, but because they'd misunderstood the nature of modern conflict. They'd prepared to fight a war of quality versus quality, skill versus skill, courage versus courage. America had fought a war of quantity times quality, accepting that multiplication was more decisive than individual excellence. The Sherman was a mediocre tank produced in excellent numbers. The Liberty ship was an ugly vessel built at beautiful speed. The B-17 was a good bomber manufactured in great quantity. Excellence was wonderful when achievable, but adequacy at scale was sufficient for victory. That was the secret that had won the war, and would now reach the moon. Systematic adequacy, replicated relentlessly, backed by industrial capacity that treated the impossible as merely an engineering problem, requiring sufficient resources. The crowd began to disperse. Hayes remained, looking at the empty launch pad, thinking about the strange inheritance of war. The techniques developed to destroy cities had been refined to explore space. The assembly lines that built bombers now built spacecraft. The engineers who'd calculated bombing tonnage now calculated orbital trajectories. The arsenal of democracy had won its war, and then, rather than dismantling, had simply redirected its attention. The same industrial philosophy that defeated fascism would now challenge the cosmos. It seemed appropriate somehow that the greatest destructive force in history would become the greatest creative force in history, simply by choosing different targets for its overwhelming productive capacity. Epilogue: the numbers that changed everything. The final accounting of World War II production reads like a fantasy, numbers so large they lose meaning until compared to what came before. Ships. The United States built 2,751 Liberty ships, 414 Victory ships, 531 attack cargo ships, and hundreds of other vessel types. Total merchant tonnage launched during the war, 33.5 million tons. By comparison, the entire world's merchant shipping in 1939 totaled 68 million tons. America replaced half the world's pre-war merchant fleet in 4 years, while simultaneously building the largest navy in history. Aircraft. American factories produced 300,317 military aircraft between 1940 and 1945 that averaged 164 aircraft per day, every day, for 5 years. At peak production in March 1944, American factories completed 9,113 aircraft, more than Germany's total monthly production. One aircraft rolled off an assembly line somewhere in America every 6 minutes, 24 hours a day, without stopping for holidays or weekends. Tanks and vehicles. 88,410 tanks of all types, 257,000 artillery pieces, 2.4 million trucks. 11.9 million rifles, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. The numbers become numbing, each figure representing industrial achievement that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. The mathematics of victory. Germany and Japan began the war with better trained militaries, superior initial equipment, and strategic initiative. They lost because they couldn't match American production. The Soviet Union absorbed catastrophic losses and survived because American equipment replaced what Hitler destroyed. Britain held out through the Blitz and U-boat warfare because American ships kept supply lines open. The arsenal of democracy didn't just supplement Allied military power, it overwhelmed Axis capacity so completely that tactical excellence became strategically irrelevant. A German tank ace could destroy 20 Shermans and still lose the battle when the 21st Sherman rolled forward. A Japanese pilot could sink 3 American carriers and watch 4 new ones arrive to replace them. A U-boat commander could sink a dozen merchant ships and see 24 more join the next convoy. For the first time in human history, one nation's industrial capacity had proven decisive in a global conflict without requiring proportional military genius or extraordinary battlefield heroism. Courage mattered. Leadership mattered. Tactics mattered. But production mattered more. The Axis powers had prepared to fight a war where superior skill and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. They encountered an enemy that treated material advantages as the foundation of strategy, accepting that adequate equipment in overwhelming quantity would eventually defeat excellent equipment in limited numbers. This was the revolution that Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock couldn't comprehend from U-96's conning tower. This was the reality that shocked Toshikazu Omai when he read production figures from American shipyards. This was the arithmetic that Albert Speer understood too late to matter. The arsenal of democracy had transformed warfare from an art practiced by warriors into an industrial process managed by engineers. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and would shape every military conflict for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Years later, historians would debate the war's turning points. Midway, Stalingrad, D-Day. Each battle would be analyzed for tactical brilliance and strategic significance. But the true turning point had occurred in places like Richmond, California, and Seattle, Washington, where workers like Yoshiko Nakamura and Rose Monroe had proven that the age of industrial warfare demanded industrial solutions. They'd built ships in days and aircraft in hours. They'd outproduced entire nations while maintaining civilian living standards that would have seemed utopian to their enemies. They'd transformed the impossible into the routine through systematic application of mass production techniques that treated war materials as just another manufacturing challenge. The Germans had called American equipment ugly ducklings and Ronson lighters, dismissing functionality in favor of elegance. The Japanese had questioned American fighting spirit, measuring courage by willingness to die rather than capacity to produce. Both nations had miscalculated catastrophically. Because in the end, the ugliest mass-produced ship could still carry supplies, the most basic tank could still advance, the adequate aircraft could still bomb. And when those supplies, tanks, and aircraft arrived in quantities that seemed to defy physics, elegance and spirit became footnotes to overwhelming material reality. The arsenal of democracy had spoken. Its voice was the thunder of rivet guns, the hiss of welding torches, the groan of cranes lifting steel. Its message was simple and devastating. In industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own. The Axis powers had learned this lesson too late to act on it, at too high a cost to survive it. The world had learned it permanently, and would never forget that wars in the modern age are won in factories long before soldiers reach the battlefield. The numbers told the story. The numbers had always told the story. The only question had been whether anyone would believe them before reality made belief irrelevant.